certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
The Claremont Serial Killings trial hit an unexpected delay today, with Justice Stephen Hall demanding an explanation. Welcome to Week 10. Natalie Bongiolo in the studio with Tim Clark and Alison Fan. Well, no one saw this one coming. How did this unravel today?
Full surprise, total shock. And yes, we wait to see what's going to happen now.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't the best start for a Monday morning, particularly for Carmel Barbagallo, because she had to basically stand up in court and say, "Your Honour, I'm very sorry, but I need at least 2 days to sort out something that's happened over the weekend." And that something was many hundreds of documents from PathWest files somehow hadn't found their way onto the court file, and most importantly, hadn't found their way to the defence. They related to some DNA testing that PathWest had done in 2003 on these crucial fingernails. And it was an almighty roadblock that really no one saw coming.
And it's not really something that would happen in a trial like this ordinarily. I mean, were you absolutely gobsmacked by this?
Absolutely. I'd go further and say it's a blunder somewhere along the lines. I mean, they've had a long time to prepare these. We know there's a lot of documents, but they only found out about it the weekend. And I think the defence lawyer and the judge wants to please explain as quickly as possible. Yeah. How did this happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen?
Yeah, well, the judge, when a judge of Stephen Hall's experience said it's extremely disappointing and
unsatisfactory.
Unsatisfactory. You know, there's a lot more in between those two words that he wanted to say.
I think that's legalese for that. He's very, very crabby.
Yeah, yes. I mean, Ali's right. He has actually asked for a formal please explain in the way of a statement from PathWest staff to ask how this happened, and also Mr. Yovich wanted exactly the same explanation. So yes, there'll be there is literally some explaining to do for PathWest.
Well, before we go through the details of what this glitch is, we'll just have a chat to criminal defence lawyer Damien Cripps, who's calling in from Perth Airport. And Damien, I understand you're about to jump on the plane, so thank you for giving us your time on this. How surprised are you by this unexpected delay?
Well, thanks for having me on, guys. I hope everyone's well. The way that I read this is potentially a little bit different. And this is just my personal view, but people make mistakes. And you can imagine that in a trial of this magnitude, and with the amount of materials and the amount of time that's gone by, it's to some extent understandable that people make mistakes. And when I say that, I mean, I agree with what Ali was saying, which I think Tim reflected on as well, that the sentiment of court was someone needs to explain how this happens. I don't disagree with that. I think it's certainly a case where when you've got so many people affected by a trial like this, somebody has to explain how we get to a point this deep in the trial where we're missing disclosure. However, people make mistakes. So the judges charged with keeping the trial moving and keeping the costs at bay. That's one of the things that he has to keep in mind. So every day that this trial goes on and over, it's costing the state money. And so that would be certainly a thought in everyone's mind, but it'd also be a case where I guess one of the big problems that arises here is that we're in the middle of a trial, and for the purposes of the defence, they don't know what's in those documents. There could be something in there that actually changes the dynamic of the whole trial. I certainly accept it's unlikely that there is, but there's certainly that possibility. So there's a number of reasons why it's a big problem, but my view is always that people make mistakes.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, as a defence lawyer, you would be sympathetic still to the prosecution, given that we know we're talking about, you know, at one point, you know, Ali had said millions of documents.
It's a lot of documents now. And look, I think we should go back a little bit further in saying, as a defence lawyer, I think as a human is the starting point for me being understanding. I'd be understanding that in a situation like this, although it's not ideal, it's certainly a case where this kind of thing can happen. The The issue is, and I don't think there's been any suggestion of it, it's not intentional. It's not like the defence or PathWest were trying to hide anything. It's simply a mistake, and so it's an unacceptable mistake, but it's something we've just got to deal with. Which sounds like that's what they've done. They've put they've put an adjournment down, and we're moving on from what is a mistake, and we're just trying to get to the other side of it as quickly as we possibly can. And I could almost guarantee you that the court would be hoping and praying that the defence don't find anything in those documents that are going to cause any further delays.
Yeah. Tim, can you talk to us about the actual details within the documents that we're talking about and what they relate to?
Yeah, so this was, we discussed it briefly on Friday. In 2003, PathWest took it upon themselves to do some low copy number DNA testing on some of these fingernail exhibits that we know are so important. They weren't actually accredited to do this low copy number testing, which relates to tiny bits of DNA and the more advanced testing that was able to be done on them. But they claimed that they had the skills that could pay those bills, and so they did it anyway, not for court purposes, but to hopefully give the investigators some new leads. Amongst those, when they did that testing, according to Mr. Bogdanovich's evidence on Friday, on at least one of those nails, this LCN testing, as it's known, discovered a trace of male DNA, and that was pretty much where we left it on Friday. So we're all really looking forward to a further explanation today as to what happened to that testing, whether it was legit, whether they followed it up. But obviously we didn't get there because, as Ms. Barbagallo explained this morning, they were having a pre-trial, or in this case mid-trial conference with some PathWest staff to come, particularly a scientist called Scott Egan. And it sounds like not only is Mr. Egan a witness, but he's also been the man that has been tasked with trying to find all the PathWest documentation on this case stretching back nearly 20 years. When they were proofing him, or when they were meeting with him on Saturday morning, amid all the hundreds and hundreds of documents, it turned up some documents relating to this testing that for whatever reason had not been passed over, most importantly to the defence. It sounded like the prosecution were not really across them either, although they'd had longer, obviously, because they'd seen them over the weekend, realised that they weren't in the huge tranche of documents that had gone through onto the court files and also onto Mr. Yovich. And so it would appear there had been frantic phone calls all weekend back and forth, and particularly between Ms. Yovich and Ms. Barbagallo, trying to work out what's happened. And then there was some I'm sure a very sheepish email had to be sent to Justice Hall and his associates either yesterday or early this morning, explaining what was happening and just giving a red flag to say, this is what I'm going to be asking for this morning. And that's what she did. She got Miss Barbagallo got on her feet, and our eyes widened as soon as we heard 2-day adjournment. And to be fair to Mr. Yovich, he then stood up, gave his position, and said, this is not of Miss Barbagallo's making. I do not blame her. I'm not pointing the finger at her, but it is what it is, and we need to sort it out for the sake of the smooth running of the trial. And as Damien said, the most important thing is to get all these documents out into the open now, and then look at what they contain. Because most pertinently, if there is a difference between what these documents have to say and what the testing results that have already been disclosed have to say, then we do really have a problem. In so much as that's going to take a lot more time to work out, and because Mr. Yovich needs time, most importantly, to get his cross-examination of Mr. Bogdanovich's ready, and then for the other PathWest scientists to come.
Because there's about 100. They said it wasn't just for a few documents.
Well, that's right. So a USB stick was handed over to Mr. Yovich about 5 minutes before court, containing all the documents that this new stuff relates to. That totaled about 830 odd documents, but Ms. Barbagallo said that's some that have already been disclosed and the new ones, or the fresh ones, or the undisclosed ones. And she said we handed them all over in a batch so Mr. Yovich could get them all in context and be able to see them all as a package, I suppose. And so that's how it was left. The judge had only seen the very first document of them all as well, just moments before he got to court. And so that's where it was left. It was all, as the judge said, unsatisfactory. I mean, as Damien said, these things do happen. Once Damien's probably gone through customs, I could talk about another trial last year that Mr. Yovich was involved that was a lot more serious than this in disclosure. But yes, it does happen. Mistakes happen. Of course they do. And to be honest, it could be just a bit of good fortune that we haven't had something happen before on such a major trial that, it's taken to day 42 for us to hit our real first snafu, apart from the screens that needed to be hastily bought from Officeworks a couple of weeks ago, just after Christmas. But everyone's gone away now to try and work it out as quickly as they can. And the point Mr. Yovich also made was there's no point in rushing back and getting and trying to get the trial back before this is all done properly. So, which is why I say Wednesday is the day that we'll find out, but it might not be the day that we get back on.
And for PathWest, more scrutiny perhaps. They've already been under scrutiny about things that have gone a little astray and things that have been mislabelled and things that haven't been labelled. This is going to probably place more focus on their procedures.
Well, that's right.
Just sorry, Natalie. Before we move on too far from that, and I know we've discussed it before, but I think it's really important just on this point to just reiterate that disclosure is the material that the state have to provide to the defence before the trial, so that defence can prepare their case to prepare for their client to answer their case. And one of the issues that might arise in this circumstance is a little bit technical, but it could cause a huge problem, is that some of the witnesses have already been called and been passed on, have been finished. Now, if something arises in this evidence that calls for the defence to need to speak to witnesses that have already been finished, well, that's a huge issue because they've been let go, and we don't. There's first of all the geographical issue of where they might be, but then there's also the procedural issue that the defence and the prosecution have both said to have been finished with that witness, and if something arises out of this evidence that the defence need to question a previous witness about, well, then that's a problem, and that's that's just one of the legal issues that arises from disclosure not being provided before the trial starts.
So, Damien, if a witness has been dismissed and they did need to be recalled, can that happen?
As we said on a number of occasions, and I think this would be one of those cases, the judge would have the discretion to make a decision to recall that witness and allow the defence to reopen their cross-examination, and they would allow the prosecution to reopen their re-examination or examination in chief, whichever way the judge decided it should be done.
I know Paul Yovich said he didn't want to point fingers, but can we just talk about how this error, I guess it's a clerical error, how this error happened?
We'll never get to the bottom of that. I guess in that report that's been ordered by the judge, in that statement that's been ordered by the judge, that's one of the reasons why I would have thought that the judge did that, is because it puts some onus back on everybody involved in the disclosure process to answer the questions of how it got to the point where we're at. And so hopefully that statement, whether it be in the form of an affidavit or like just a signed statement by somebody, it'll give the court some indication of how that happened, and it'll allow the DPP and the PathWest people to go back through their trail and make sure that in the future that doesn't happen. But one of the things that when Mr. Yovich says not pointing the fingers, I think what you can take from that is that it's not a case where we're pointing our fingers, but what we're saying collectively as a legal institution is that let's get together, let's get to the bottom of this and find out why we're in this position, because we don't want to be in this position in the future.
That's right. And as you mentioned, Ali, PathWest have already been under such scrutiny, and the fact that these documents are missing doesn't go down well.
It was a bit muddled about what was missing, what was scanned, what was handed over but it was a whole hard lever file apparently, but it wasn't just one or two documents. And because it centres on this evidence that is at the heart of this trial, the crucial DNA, I think that's what's brought it into focus more than anything. If it was just some other stuff, but it's right down to the nitty-gritty of what this trial's all about. And that was my first thought, will witnesses be recalled? Because I don't know whether they're referring to something next week. What were you going to be sitting at night time next week? Is that trying to hurry it up or what? 4 to 8 o'clock or something?
No,
yeah.
that's to do with the time difference to the UK.
Okay.
We'll explore that a little bit later. But Damien's exactly right, and that's where exactly the quickest point that Justice Hall made was, it's all very well Mr. Bogdanovich having to hang around maybe for a couple of days, but what about witnesses that have gone? Is this going to contradict what they've got to say? And no one could really say, because no one had really got their heads around all these documents yet, particularly Mr. Yovich. So I think everyone will be holding their breath come Wednesday morning to see what first Miss Barbagallo and then Mr. Yovich has to say, having perused these documents for a couple of days, because if the ripple effect could be a lot wider and a lot deeper, but we can only hope that some very, very good brains will get their heads around it, and they can come to some arrangement.
Yeah. Did Carmel Barbagallo give any indication that the documents would be consistent with what's been presented, or was that question not asked?
Well, she was asked, and she said as far as she knew, that there wasn't any huge inconsistencies there, which was a little bit of a relief, but.
From her point of
view, exactly.
Maybe the defence will think differently.
The judge will read them, and he's, as we've said so many times, I mean, he's as sharp as a razor blade, so he'll cut through pretty quick. And then obviously Mr. Yovich as well, who's coming at from a different angle, but will be looking for the same things.
And did obviously outside court each day, and then when something like this happens, the journalists and the news crews are outside waiting, was questions asked of the prosecutor or the defence, and did they have anything to say?
Well, of course, we ask the questions. We know that there's not going to be any elaborate answer because their legal ethics prevent them from commenting on any case outside the court. So for TV purposes, we did get our little 5-second grab, which gives us a story for the TV news, and that's really all we needed to point out that, one, this is what's happened, two, it's going to be delayed, and we don't even know if it's going to be Wednesday when they come back. But this actually broke up a very, very boring, from a television point of view, DNA mind-numbing experience. And it's this is why this trial is so full of surprises. One, we get a visit from the police commissioner. Two, there's suddenly a suppression ban that no one can explain. And three, today we've lost everything altogether. So it does keep that story in the focus of the public, because otherwise the DNA stuff is really like deciphering code.
Well, only Alison Fan could say court being called off is a better story than court being on all day.
Absolutely.
You have to keep your wits about you at the moment, don't you, really?
Well.
So you mentioned that the adjournment is for a couple of days, but do you suspect that we could be talking for a longer period of time because of the amount of documents that need to be looked over?
Yes, I do, if I'm being frank. And I think it was sort of hinted at from all parties that, we'll come back on Wednesday and see where we're at, which is never a hugely satisfying answer. But the technicality of them, the amount of them, the fact that there's several layers to look at. Okay, we're not just looking at the witnesses on the stand right at the moment and the witness to come, but we're also looking at the witnesses that have gone. So they'll be reading and rereading, and plus, if the judge wants this, please explain before we start again, then that's going to take a while too. So there's plenty of work to do over the next 2 days, even though they're not actually standing up in court and doing that work. So if I'm being honest, I'm sceptical about a Wednesday restart.
And His Honour will be even more displeased if that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Damien, how long does it take a defence team to go through an additional unforeseen 400 or so documents?
It depends if you're billing by the hour, isn't it, Damien?
Well, we're always billing by the hour. And the reason why we're billing by the hour, if anybody's actually sat down with a document from PathWest or one of those companies, to go through them is quite painstaking because you don't want to miss anything. You have to make sure that you read the whole thing and you're across everything that it says. So obviously to go through that amount of documents and how long that would take, guys, is too difficult to answer. But there's a couple of things to consider in that proposition is if Mr. Yovich was doing it on his own, well then that would be an extremely arduous task. I imagine that he has a team of some sort helping him and some solicitors that can go through those documents. But what's got to be considered in that, if it was the other way around, if it was a case where the state was just going through them, they've got a big office down there where there's a lot of staff that can get involved in an emergency situation like this. But I'm not sure that Mr. Edwards' defence team is financially set up with the same structure. So essentially, whatever they've got, whatever their team is, that's what they've got. And they're just going to have to sit down and go through it as quickly as they possibly can because the onus will fall back on them to make sure they do, which they will, go through the documents and comprehend them and understand what they mean in the context of the trial, and then come back and be ready to deal with the trial to continue on in the knowledge of what those documents comprise.
Yeah. And it was interesting this morning, Damien touched on it a little bit. You get this impression from Law and Order and various movies about the antagonistic prosecution versus defence, and of course it is a contest, and they're both arguing different points. But there was a collegiality this morning that belied possibly the blunder by Mr. Yovich saying, "I don't blame Miss Barbagallo." Miss Barbagallo saying, "We're going to work with you to try and get all this sorted as quickly as we can." So it's
all the same. Tim, he did demand an explanation, a written report. Yeah,
that is true. But I get the impression that Justice Hall would have asked for that anyway. So I think just Mr. Yovich got in first then because he said, "Well, yes, Mr. Yovich deserves one, and frankly, so do I." And Damien's point is absolutely right. These trials are not cheap to run either. You're talking of tens of thousands of dollars a day with all the court staff and security and resources that it takes up. This is 2 days now lost at least, which is a cost to the taxpayer, if you want to put it that way as well. So maybe we'll demand an extra please explain as well, Ali, or at least ask to see the judges.
Well, the prosecution has also got about 3 times the number of the defence team, and they've probably got more lawyers at their fingertips. So I understand a couple of those on the defence team are law students sitting back there.
Yep.
So that was the first thing that I thought. You've got a department as big as the DPP not picking this up till the weekend before. I know they're doing a lot of this on the run and stuff's coming through at the last minute, but the weekend before, I just thought, okay.
But it's difficult to know that documents exist if you haven't seen them.
Yes.
So,
all of a sudden they're saying, "What's this? We've never seen this before."
PathWest is a pretty well financed and organisation as well. The top forensic lab in the state, government owned. So you would have to trust them to be able to at least find everything and hand it over when they're supposed to. So yeah, there'll be a few questions bouncing around all over the place.
And Mr. Yovich did acknowledge that Carmel Barbagallo is indeed working very hard.
Well, we all know that. I mean, that is stating the bleeding obvious.
They're being very polite to each other.
Yeah, they are.
Court.
They were and cordial. You don't want to. Well, some lawyers do want to hop up and down and make a big point of it, but you don't get the impression that Mr. Yovich is trying to score points against someone who he knows is working, as hard, if not harder, than he is.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about the witnesses next week that we were looking at late sitting. So what's that about?
Yes, Tim, I'd like to know. Why am I coming to court at 8 o'clock at night?
You were chasing lawyers down the street when I was doing that important bit of work. So this is some witnesses that are beamed in via satellite from the UK. So this is the Forensic Science Service that we talked about, the crucial lab in the UK that did the work in 2008, that eventually did find, through low copy number testing, the male DNA hit on Ciara's fingernails, which the prosecution alleges are Mr. Edwards's, or is Mr. Edwards's DNA. And they are staff members, including a guy called Andrew Talbot, who was the actual scientist who did that swabbing and extracting and was, doing all the business back in 2008. Obviously very important, but given the time difference to the UK, we will be starting late, around about 4 o'clock our time, which is 8 a.m. their time. Ms. Barbagallo, I suggested, and this is why I said about the working hard or not harder. She suggested that we all sit till 10 o'clock at night to get in all this evidence. The judge wasn't too enamoured with that idea, so he said maybe till 8 o'clock, but we'll see how we go. And because this is being done by video link, it creates all its own problems. We had a previous video link, obviously, to the third wheel, if we remember that evidence way back in week 2 or 3. And so, it's just the nature of this trial. It's global, as our listenership has showed us. There's interest from all over the world and witnesses from all over the world. So that's what we'll get to next week and then and beyond.
So none of the overseas experts are actually coming up, or we're doing it all by video link?
I get an idea that Dr. Whittaker is, Jonathan
FBI?
Whittaker. I think he is, because he wasn't mentioned this morning, but Miss Talbot and another scientist were. Given he is so important, I've been led to believe that he will be in person, but who knows? This delay might knock everything out because witness availability and all the ripple effects from a trial being delayed. There'll be a lot of shuffling of cards and papers and emails and Skype and all the rest of it. I think this week
it will probably be quite a big week with maybe some catch up going on if it doesn't sort of move quickly this week. Well, we need to let Damien go because you're about to jump on your plane, aren't you?
Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you for calling into us, and thank you both for your time today. So while court won't be sitting tomorrow, we'll be back with an extra episode, 25 years to the day when Bradley Edwards brutally raped a teenage girl. We hope you can join us tomorrow for Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.